You ever have a moment in life that clings to you? A moment that no matter how hard you try, you just can't shake it? It doesn't matter how much time passes. You wake up and it's there. You go about your day, pretending, smiling, acting like everything is normal, but deep inside, that moment is still there. Sitting in the back of your mind like an unwanted guest that refuses to leave. That's what this is for me. It's been 2 years. 2 years. And yet, I still find myself staring at the ceiling some nights, replaying it over and over again. Asking myself the same questions I've asked 1,000 times. How did it happen? Why did it happen? And if I could go back, would I change it? You see, some mistakes are easy to fix. You break a glass? You sweep it up. You say something hurtful? You apologize. But then, there are other mistakes. The kind that don't have an undo button. The kind that, once you've made them, they're a part of you. Forever. That's what this was. And the worst part? I saw it coming. Not all at once. No, it was slower than that. More subtle. Like a quiet whisper in the background of my life, growing louder and louder, until suddenly, it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a full-blown storm, and I was standing right in the middle of it, powerless to stop it. I can still remember the exact moment when everything changed. The exact second when I knew that I had crossed a line I could never uncross. And I swear to you, I didn't mean for it to happen, but it did. And now I have to live with it. This isn't just a story. It's a confession. A part of me hopes that by saying it out loud, by putting it out there, maybe I'll finally be able to let it go. Or maybe it'll just haunt me even more. Either way, you deserve to hear the truth. But before I tell you everything, before I take you down this road with me, I need to ask you something. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Because I've played this scenario in my head 1,000,000 times, searching for a different answer, a different outcome. And every single time, I come up empty. So tell me, if you were me, would you have done what I did? Before we get into this, make sure you're subscribed to Shocking Infidelity Saga for more real-life confessions that will leave you questioning everything. And drop a comment below, because by the time I'm done telling you my story, I want to know what you think. Alright, let me take you back to where it all started. My name is Ella. I'm 44 years old. Married. From the outside, my life probably looked good. Maybe even enviable. A beautiful home. A successful husband, financial security. But let me tell you something, appearances? They mean nothing. You can live in a house big enough to get lost in and still feel like you have nowhere to go. You can sleep next to someone for years and still feel completely alone. That was my life. It wasn't always like that, of course. There was a time when I was happy. When my husband, David, looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. When we couldn't keep our hands off each other. When we had conversations, not just small talk about bills and groceries, but real, deep conversations. About life. About dreams. About us. But that version of us? That was a lifetime ago. Somewhere along the way, the love we had turned into something else. Something cold. Routine. Predictable. I can't even pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the late nights at the office that turned into entire weekends away. Maybe it was the unanswered texts, the distracted nods when I spoke, the way he stopped noticing when I did my hair or put on a new dress. Or maybe it was me. Maybe I stopped trying too. All I know is that one day I woke up and I felt like a stranger in my own marriage. Like I had become part of the furniture there, but unseen. Invisible. That's the word that stuck with me the most. Because that's what I was to David. I could sit right next to him on the couch, my body just inches from his, and still feel 1,000 miles away. I could kiss him goodnight and wonder if he even felt it. You don't realize how much that kind of loneliness eats away at you, until one day, you look in the mirror and you don't even recognize yourself anymore. And that's where I was. And then, there was him. Liam. David's son from his first marriage. My stepson. He was 20. Young, yes, but not a child. He had a presence about him, something effortless, something that made people gravitate toward him. He wasn't just handsome, he was magnetic. And unlike David, he saw me. Not in any obvious or inappropriate way, at least, not at first. But he noticed things. The little things. Like the way I sighed when I thought no one was listening. The way I turned my phone over on the table, pretending I wasn't waiting for a message that never came. The way my laugh sounded different when I was genuinely happy versus when I was just going through the motions. And then there were the compliments. They weren't extravagant or flirtatious. They were subtle, natural, effortless. "Ella, that color looks beautiful on you." Or, "When I cooked dinner, you always make the best meals." Or, "When I passed by the living room, you smell nice." Simple words. But when you've spent years being unnoticed, simple words can feel like oxygen. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That I was just reading into things. That I was only noticing him because I was so used to not being noticed at all. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Because the way I started noticing him, that was different. It started on a night that should have been just like any other. A quiet dinner. The three of us sitting at the same table, but in completely different worlds. David, as always, was barely there. Physically, yes. Sitting at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone between half-hearted bites of his food. Occasionally muttering a yeah or whenever I tried to make conversation. But mentally, emotionally, he was somewhere else. Somewhere I wasn't invited. I stopped trying a long time ago. Instead, I focused on my plate, chewing in silence, pretending not to notice how empty the room felt. How empty I felt. And then, Liam spoke. "How was your day, Ella?" It was a simple question. An ordinary one. But it caught me off guard. Because David never asked. I looked up, and there he was leaning forward slightly, elbows resting on the table, his full attention on me. I hesitated for a second, almost embarrassed that the question had shaken me. That I suddenly felt the need to answer honestly. And so I did. "It was fine," I said. And then, because something in his expression made me feel like I could say more, I added, just the usual. "Running errands. Cooking. Cleaning. Nothing exciting." "You do a lot," he said, his voice softer now. "I hope you know that." I laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Not that anyone notices." He tilted his head slightly, studying me. "I do," he said. And just like that, the air changed. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the way he said them. The way they landed. The way I felt them settle deep inside me, in a place that had been empty for a long, long time. I glanced at David, wondering if he'd heard, if he'd noticed the shift in the room. But of course, he was too busy typing something into his phone, completely oblivious. And somehow, that made it worse. Because at that moment, I realized I wanted him to notice. I wanted him to look up. To hear what Liam had said. To feel even a fraction of the discomfort I was feeling. But he didn't. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I was more angry at him or at myself. Later that night, after the dishes were washed and the house had settled into its usual silence, I found myself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. David was asleep beside me, his back turned, as it had been for months now. I should have been asleep, too. I was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't let me rest. I kept hearing Liam's voice. I do. I kept feeling the warmth in his tone, the way his eyes had lingered just a second too long. And most of all, I kept replaying that feeling, that quiet, dangerous thrill that had passed through me when he said it. I told myself I was overthinking, that it was nothing. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. So I got up. I told myself I just needed some air. A glass of water, anything to clear my head. As I made my way down the hallway, the house felt different. Heavier. Like something unseen had settled in the air, pressing against my skin. And then, as I passed by the living room, I saw him. Liam. Sitting on the couch, illuminated only by the dim glow of the TV. His posture was relaxed, but there was something else, something tense, something unreadable in his expression as he stared at the screen. And then, as if he felt me there, he turned. Our eyes met. And that was the moment. Because the way he looked at me, it wasn't the way a stepson should look at his stepmother. It was different. There was something unspoken in his eyes, something I couldn't quite name, but felt deep in my chest. A tension. A question. A hesitation, like he was waiting to see what I would do next. I should have looked away. I should have walked past him without a second thought. But I didn't. For a second, just 1 second, I stayed there. And then, without a word, I turned and walked away. But as I climbed back into bed, my heart pounding harder than it should have been, I knew. I knew. That wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The way my heart picked up speed when he walked into a room. The way I found myself waiting, just a little too long. For him to speak, just to hear his voice. The way my skin tingled when he passed behind me, just close enough that I could feel him. And those glances. At first, they were nothing. Fleeting. Accidental. But then they weren't. They lasted a second too long. A hesitation. A pause. A moment where neither of us looked away as quickly as we should have. And the worst part? I liked it. I liked the way he made me feel. I liked feeling seen. I liked the way my body reacted to him in a way it hadn't reacted to anyone in years. And that scared me. Because deep down, I knew that once you notice something, once you really see it, there's no unseeing it. And once you open a door, even just a crack, it only takes one moment to push it wide open. I told myself I would never cross that line. I told myself I was stronger than that. I told myself a lot of things. But the truth is, some lines don't look like lines until you've already crossed them. And by the time I realized it, it was already too late. That night changed everything. Not in a loud, obvious way. Nothing happened, not really. No words were spoken. No lines were crossed. But something shifted. And once a thought like that takes root, once it settles inside you, it's almost impossible to unthink it. I told myself it was nothing. That I was overanalyzing. That I was just lonely, touch-starved, desperate to feel something again. That the way he looked at me was just a trick of the dim lighting, a meaningless flicker of a moment my mind had twisted into something more. But if that were true, why couldn't I stop thinking about it? The next morning, I tried to pretend nothing was different. Tried to act normal. But the thing about moments like that? They leave traces. And once you see something, you start seeing everything. Liam walked into the kitchen, hair messy from sleep, shirt hanging loosely over his lean frame, and I felt it immediately, that awareness. That tension. Or was I imagining it? He poured himself a cup of coffee, stood near me at the counter. Close. Not too close. Not enough to mean anything, but enough to notice. I told myself it was nothing. Then he spoke. Did you sleep well? A simple question. Harmless. But my mind flashed back to the night before, to the way his eyes had lingered on me in the dark, to the way my body had reacted to it. I hesitated for just a second too long. His gaze flickered over me, curious, searching. And suddenly, I was hyper-aware of everything. The way my pulse quickened. The way my breath felt a little too shallow. The way his presence felt different now, heavier, like he knew something had changed too. And then he smiled. And just like that, the thought burrowed in deeper. I spent the next few days convincing myself it was nothing. That I was just reading into things. That I was just lonely. Because I was lonely. David barely looked at me anymore. We moved around each other like two strangers renting the same space. The only time he touched me was out of habit, a quick kiss on the cheek before leaving for work, a hand on my shoulder in passing. Empty gestures. I couldn't remember the last time he really saw me. So maybe that's all this was. Maybe I was just desperate for attention. Maybe Liam was just being kind. Maybe I was making a fool of myself, twisting normal moments into something forbidden just because I wanted to feel wanted again. But if that were true, why did I keep catching him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention? Why did his presence linger when we were alone? Why did my stomach tighten every time I heard his footsteps approaching? And why, when his arm brushed against mine in the hallway, did I feel that slow, burning heat creep up my spine? I started noticing everything. The way he always seemed to be in the same room as me. The way his compliments felt different. Effortless, natural, but still different. That dress looks amazing on you. You're really beautiful, you know that. The way his voice dipped just slightly when he said my name. At first, I told myself it was just Liam being Liam. He was charming, after all. He knew how to make people feel good. It was part of who he was. But then, there were the touches. Small, innocent, accidental. Or at least, they should have been. His hand brushing against mine when we reached for the same plate. His palm resting against the small of my back for just a second too long when he passed behind me. The way he leaned in close when he spoke to me, his breath warm against my skin, making the tiny hairs on my arms stand on end. They weren't big things. But they weren't nothing either. And the worst part? I wasn't pulling away. Every night, I told myself I wouldn't think about him. And every night, I did. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind tangled in thoughts I shouldn't be having. Was I imagining it? Was I making something out of nothing? Or was there something real happening between us, something unspoken, something neither of us wanted to name? Because if it was real, if I wasn't just making this up in my head, then where did that leave us? Where did that leave me? I told myself I wouldn't let it happen, that I knew better, that I was in control. But looking back now, I realize the truth. The moment you start asking yourself if something is happening, it already is. And the moment you start telling yourself you won't cross a line, you're already standing at the edge. I think, deep down, I always knew there was going to be a moment. A moment where everything that had been building, all the glances, the tension, the thoughts I had spent weeks trying to ignore, would come to a head. I just didn't know when. Or maybe I did. Maybe I'd been waiting for it. And then, one night, it happened. David was away on a business trip. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. He traveled so often now, I barely even noticed when he was gone. But that night, the house felt different. Quieter. Like something was sitting in the air, thick and waiting. I had just poured myself a glass of wine, telling myself I'd drink it alone, curl up on the couch, maybe watch some mindless TV until I was tired enough to fall asleep without my thoughts following me to bed. And then Liam walked in. Drinking alone? He asked, a teasing smile playing at his lips. I shrugged. I guess so. He hesitated for half a second. Then, mind if I join you? I should have said no. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, watched as he grabbed a glass for himself, poured just enough to match mine. And then we sat. At first, it was light. Easy. We talked about movies. Music. The kind of surface-level things that made it feel normal, like we weren't sitting in that dimly lit room, drinking together while my husband was miles away, completely unaware. But then, the conversation shifted. He asked me about David. I should have been careful. I should have kept it short, polite, the way I always did when people asked. But there was something in his eyes, something open, something genuine, and before I could stop myself, the truth slipped out. It's not the same anymore, I said. He tilted his head slightly, like he was waiting for more. So I gave it to him. It's been like this for years, I admitted, staring down at my glass. We don't talk. We don't touch. Sometimes I feel like I could disappear, and he wouldn't even notice. Silence. When I looked up, Liam's expression was unreadable. Then, quietly, too quietly, he said, I notice you. I felt it then. The shift. The crack in the carefully constructed wall I had been building between us. A second passed. Then another. And then I said something I shouldn't have. What do you notice? A mistake. A slip. An invitation. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering. Everything. And that was when I knew. This wasn't in my head. It had never been in my head. This was real. The room felt warmer. Or maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way my skin tingled under his stare, the way my pulse beat a little too fast in my throat. I was still holding my glass, but I had forgotten about the wine. I was too busy noticing other things. The way his fingers curled around the stem of his own glass. The way his shoulders moved when he exhaled, slow and measured. The way his knee was just close enough to mine, almost touching but not quite, a space so small it felt intentional. And then, without thinking, without planning, I reached forward. Just to take the bottle. Just to pour myself another drink. But as I did, My fingers brushed against his. A small thing. An innocent thing. Or at least, it should have been. But neither of us moved. For a second, just a second, we stayed like that. My hand resting lightly over his, skin on skin, warmth bleeding into warmth. And I felt it. The way his breath hitched, the way mine did too. The way something unspoken stretched between us, taut and trembling. I should have pulled away. But I didn't. And neither did he. Instead, his fingers shifted, just slightly, pressing against mine in the faintest, most imperceptible way. But I felt it. And suddenly, it wasn't about the wine anymore. It wasn't about the conversation. It was about this. This feeling, this moment, this dangerous, electric space between us that was only getting smaller. Liam's lips parted, like he was about to say something. I braced myself. But he didn't speak. He just looked at me. And in that look, I saw everything. A question, a confession, a warning, and worst of all, a dare. The air was thick. Too thick. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, in my throat, in the very tips of my fingers. I knew, in that moment, that if I leaned in, if I so much as moved an inch closer, everything would change. That there would be no going back. That this wouldn't be something I could forget, or explain away, or push into the dark corners of my mind. That if we crossed that line, we would never uncross it. I swallowed hard. And then, finally, I pulled my hand away. The spell broke. Liam exhaled, slow and shaky, running a hand through his hair, like he was trying to ground himself. I stood. I told myself I was doing the right thing. That walking away now meant something. That it proved something. But as I turned and walked toward my bedroom, my pulse still thrumming, my body still alive in a way it hadn't been in years, I knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was only a matter of time. There's always a moment before it happens. A final second where the universe holds its breath, waiting to see what you'll do. Where you could still turn back, still pretend you never felt what you felt, never thought what you thought. But then, you don't. And everything changes. It happened on a night much like the others. Or maybe that's a lie. Maybe deep down, I knew that night was different before it even began. David was still away. The house was still too quiet. And Liam was still there. The tension between us hadn't disappeared after that moment with the wine, it had only grown. Thickened. Pressed in from all sides, wrapping around me, making it impossible to breathe without feeling him. I tried to ignore it. Tried to tell myself that as long as we didn't do anything, it didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Because the worst part about desire isn't the act itself. It's the waiting. The slow, agonizing anticipation of what you know is going to happen. And that night, I stopped waiting. I don't even remember what we were talking about. It didn't matter. All I remember is that we were in the kitchen. The lights were dim. The air was heavy. I was standing by the counter, my hands gripping the edge like it was the only thing keeping me upright. Liam was close. Too close. And then, without thinking, without planning, I turned to say something, and he was right there. His face inches from mine, his breath warm against my lips. We both froze. A moment stretched between us, trembling, fragile. And then, I kissed him. Or maybe he kissed me. I don't know who moved first. I don't know which one of us finally gave in. All I know is that suddenly, his lips were on mine, and nothing else existed. Not my husband. Not my marriage. Not the years of silence and distance and loneliness that had brought me here. Just this. Just him. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt alive. But then, it ended. I don't even know who pulled away first. All I know is that 1 second, I was lost in him, in his warmth, in the way his hands had found my waist like they belonged there, and the next, there was nothing but silence. Heavy. Suffocating. I could still feel his breath against my skin, still taste him on my lips. But he wasn't touching me anymore. He was just looking at me. And that was worse. Because in his eyes, I saw everything. The desire. The guilt. The question. What now? I swallowed hard, forcing myself to step back. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing. I could hear it in my ears, feel it in my chest, in my throat. But I couldn't speak. Because what was there to say? I had crossed the line. And there was no coming back from it. Not really. Not ever. Liam's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides, like he was fighting something inside himself. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Ella, just my name. Nothing else." But it wasn't a question. It was a realization. An acknowledgement of what we had just done. Of what we were. And for the first time, I didn't know if I regretted it. And that was the most dangerous part of all. The next morning, everything was different. Not in an obvious way. The house still looked the same. The sun still streamed through the windows in that soft, golden way it always did. The coffee still brewed, filling the air with the same familiar scent. But underneath it all, something had shifted. And there was no undoing it. I heard him before I saw him. Footsteps down the hall. The quiet creak of the floorboards. I was standing by the kitchen counter, gripping my coffee mug like it was the only thing keeping me steady. And then, he was there. I felt him before I even looked up. His presence, heavy and lingering, like the ghost of something we weren't ready to face. For a long second, neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. And when I finally forced myself to glance up, our eyes met, just for a second, just long enough for a jolt of something hot and dangerous to flash between us, and then he looked away. Like it hadn't happened. Like we hadn't happened. And that hurt. Because part of me, maybe the worst part of me, had expected something else. A look. A word. Something. But instead, he just walked to the fridge, poured himself a glass of water, and acted like nothing had changed. Like I wasn't standing there, remembering the way his lips had felt against mine. I told myself this was a good thing. That it was better this way. That whatever had happened last night had been a mistake, a moment of weakness, and it was best if we never spoke about it again. But the silence between us wasn't normal. It wasn't the comfortable kind, the kind that existed before, when we would sit in the same room, him scrolling through his phone, me reading a book. No need to fill the space with empty words. This silence was loud. It was suffocating. It was filled with everything we weren't saying. And the worst part? I didn't know if I wanted him to break it, or if I wanted to pretend it never happened just as much as he did. I spent the entire day on edge, jumping at every sound, flinching whenever my phone buzzed, convinced it was David, somehow knowing what I had done, even though he was miles away. The paranoia crept in like a slow, tightening noose. What if Liam told someone? What if he regretted it? What if I had just destroyed everything? Every time Liam walked into the room, my stomach twisted itself into knots. Because I could feel it, the shift in the way he carried himself, the way his eyes darted away too quickly, like he was afraid of looking at me for too long. And yet, there were other moments. Moments where he lingered. Where he stood a little too close when he didn't need to. Where his hand brushed against mine when he reached for something, and neither of us pulled away as quickly as we should have. And I hated myself for it, but I found myself waiting for those moments. Craving them. Like some part of me, some dark, reckless part, wanted him to break. To crack. To admit that he felt it too. Liam was different now. Sometimes he was distant. Detached. Cold in a way he never was before. Like he was punishing himself for what happened. Like he was punishing me. And I told myself that was good. That it meant we were moving past it. But then, there were other times. Times when he was too familiar. When he would lean in a little too close, his breath warm against my neck as he reached past me. When his eyes would linger on my lips for just a second too long before looking away. When his voice would dip, lower, softer, in a way that made my skin prickle with heat. It was like he was battling something inside himself, pulling away, only to push back again. And I hated it. Because it was making me battle something inside myself. I told myself it was just a mistake. That it was one mistake. That it would never happen again. That it couldn't happen again. But the problem with crossing a line is that once you step over it, it's easier to do it again. And again. And again. And every time I saw him, Every time I felt his presence, his warmth, his hesitation, I felt it creeping closer. That inevitable pull. That slow, dangerous slide towards something I couldn't come back from. And the worst part? The part one couldn't even admit to myself? I didn't want to stop. I should have wanted to stop. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was just waiting for an excuse. For one more moment. For something, anything, to push me over the edge. And this time, I wasn't sure if I would hold myself back. I used to think I was a good person. Not perfect. Not without flaws. But good. I thought I knew who I was, what I stood for. I thought I had lines that would never blur, boundaries that would never be crossed. But then, him. And now? Now I wasn't so sure. Because every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't recognize the woman staring back at me. And worse than that, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. The guilt came in waves. Sometimes it was small. A whisper in the back of my mind, something I could ignore if I kept myself busy enough, distracted enough. Other times, it was suffocating. I'd be doing something mundane, washing the dishes, folding laundry, sitting across from David at dinner while he scrolled through his phone, oblivious, and suddenly, it would hit me. What have I done? The weight of it pressed down on my chest, stealing my breath. Because I knew that no matter how much I tried to justify it, no matter how many times I told myself it was just one moment, one mistake. It wasn't. Because I wanted it to happen again. That was the worst part. The part one couldn't admit to anyone but myself. Because the truth was, if I could go back and undo it, I don't know if I would. I kept trying to reason with myself, telling myself that it wasn't really my fault, that I had been lonely, that I had been invisible in my own marriage for so long that when someone finally looked at me, really looked at me, I had been too weak to resist, that it was just a moment, that it didn't mean anything. But I knew better, because moments don't just happen. People choose them. And I had chosen this. I had let it build, let it grow, let the tension coil tighter and tighter between us until there was nowhere left for it to go but over the edge. I could blame my marriage. I could blame David for his neglect, his absence, his emotional distance. I could blame Liam for being too attentive, too warm, too there when I needed someone to see me. But at the end of the day, none of that mattered. Because the truth was simple. I let it happen. I wanted it to happen. And I didn't know how to live with that. I knew I had to stop it. Knew I had to put distance between us before it was too late. So I told myself I would. I rehearsed the conversation in my head over and over. I would tell him it was a mistake. That it couldn't happen again. That we had to pretend it never happened at all. But when I finally tried, the words felt like sand in my mouth. Liam walked into the room, and suddenly, my resolve wavered. Because he looked different. Not in an obvious way. But I could feel it. The way he held himself. The way his eyes flickered toward me, hesitant but heavy with something unspoken. And worst of all, the way he waited. Waited for me to say something. Waited for me to make the next move. Waited for me to decide if this was the end, or if we were just getting started. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. We need to stop this, I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. It sounded distant. Hollow. A pause. Then, his voice quiet. Is that what you really want? I should have said yes. I should have been firm, unwavering. But instead, I hesitated. And that was all he needed to know. Because my silence? It was an answer. And the damage was already done. So, tell me, what would you have done? If you had spent years in a marriage where you felt unseen, unheard, untouched. If you had felt yourself fading day by day, becoming someone even you barely recognized. If suddenly, out of nowhere, someone saw you again. If someone reminded you that you were still alive. Would you have walked away? Would you have fought it, pushed it down, forced yourself to pretend it wasn't there? Or would you have done what I did? Because I've replayed this in my mind over and over again, looking for the moment I could have stopped it. But the truth is, once the thought takes root, once the feeling settles in your bones, is there really any stopping it? Or are we just fooling ourselves into believing we have more control than we actually do? Do you think desire makes people weak? Or do you think it's just human? I want to know what you think. Tell me in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been in a situation like this, where you knew what was right, but something stronger, something deeper, was pulling you in the other direction. And if you want more stories like this, real, raw, stories that expose the darkest corners of human nature, make sure to like this video, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, there's always more to the story. Some choices change you forever. There's no undoing them. No taking them back. No waking up the next day and pretending you're still the person you were before. I wish I could say I regret it. That I wish it had never happened. But the truth is, I don't know if I do. And that's the part that haunts me the most. Because I thought I was strong. I thought I had boundaries that couldn't be crossed, lines that were too thick, too clear, to ever be blurred. But now I know the truth. Loneliness can push you to places you never thought you'd go. It can make you crave things you never thought you'd crave. And the worst part? Once you've crossed a line like that, there's no going back. Be careful. Because the moment you tell yourself it'll never happen to me, that's when it already has.